So the ground search process is going to be a long process, as some of the other members have talked about. And it's really mindful to the organizing committee and survivors to plan out how it is that they're going to be providing emotional support throughout that whole process, because it's going to be a traumatic process. So there's different decisions that have to be made all the way along. And then the archives are always going to be there for a while, but one of the things to consider is doing a statement gathering process with the survivors that are still with us. But in addition to that too, is that maybe some family members of survivors have heard the stories from their parents before they have gone on too. So it's important to be collecting that information and to be providing support to people it is that you're collecting information from, and their family members as well too. So it's always really important to be inclusive of everybody that's included in the process, and also too is the community. The communities of all the schools that have been impacted are going to be impacted, and how is support going to be provided to them. Say that one school is in Gordon's, but students came from, say, Prince Albert, and they came from Manitoba, they came from Alberta, and they came from all different places in Saskatchewan. So how do you work with those communities to make sure that they are getting support, and working with the health supports in those areas as well too is to cover that large area that the schools went to, because when the students were sent to the schools, they were sent from long distances, and so that's something it is that we have to be mindful of when you're doing the ground search, is being inclusive of everybody, and don't want to leave anyone out. And the government has made a history of leaving people out of the process, and so this process, the ground search process, should be really inclusive as much as possible, and to think about how it is that you're going to keep people emotionally safe, and including ceremony in that process as well. Ceremony, but then also too is that we have to remember some students, some survivors still believe in the church way, and we have to be mindful of that too as well.
I've said before that before starting this work, communities and nations will want to do some visioning, to set some goals around what they want to get out of this process. I say this because a ground search might not be necessary or even desired for every community. If you do want to do a ground search, there are many questions that you'll need to consider. As our committee has heard in the past, sometimes the ground search is actually a water search, which could present a whole other set of questions. But as Brenda has mentioned, and as our colleague Raymond has also pointed out, there were residential schools that institutionalized children from upwards of 30 communities. And particularly when you get to the north, those children could have came from thousands of kilometers away. And so if you have a family in the high Arctic who, their relative, maybe even, a more distant ancestor was institutionalized at a residential school or even an Indian hospital or some other psychiatric institution, you are going to have to coordinate those efforts from very far away with a different community, possibly a different Indigenous nation. And so what does that look like? So when we think about ground searches, I would urge people to ask if that is a necessary component in their healing, what it is they're looking to learn from that process, and maybe if a ground search becomes too complicated, too drawn out, too expensive. We do know that there are a shortage of qualified individuals in these fields. What could you possibly look at next that would help bring a certain level of closure and healing if a ground or water search is not possible.
A ground search is a process of using technology to look below the surface of the ground for potential remains or disturbances that could be associated with unmarked graves. It uses a number of different types of technology. One of the most commonly used is ground penetrating radar, but it's important to know that ground penetrating radar is not the only search technology that can be used to locate potential unmarked graves, and it doesn't work everywhere. It's very important to understand the landscape around the locations you wish to search before applying any technology, including ground penetrating radar. Once enough information is gathered to identify areas that could potentially contain unmarked burials, then technology can be brought in. Ground penetrating radar is the most commonly used because it sends a signal into the earth to detect areas where there could have been a grave dug. It works well in environments where there's organized graves. It's used in historic cemeteries a fair bit for this reason, but it does not itself provide evidence of human remains. It's looking only at the soil, the characteristics of the soil, and how it's been disturbed. It's important that someone who is conducting ground penetrating radar has training in how to make sense of the information in order to find these potential locations of unmarked graves, and is able to report that information back to the community in a timely manner with an understanding that we can never be sure with ground penetrating radar alone that we are finding a grave. This is where other information is really essential. For example, information from survivors about the potential of unmarked graves being in an area, information from historic maps or photographs that shows what might have been there. Ground penetrating radar, for example, can detect a building foundation, but it won't be able to tell you if there are graves in that building foundation. Technology is one component of searching. There are methods to search the ground from the actual physical ground itself as well as from the air, but it is difficult to get certainty with these technologies. There needs to be many different pieces of information brought together. There's a number of different factors that influence whether or not a burial could be detected. This includes what has happened to the land since the school was in use, the conditions of the soil itself, what is it made out of, what type of technology you're using, and does it make sense for the soil that you are searching, and also recognizing that in order to do this work well takes a lot of time.